Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. Today's episode is going to take a look at the week beginning March 30th. And in fact, I'm going to talk about an astro event that begins on April 1st. That is Mercury Retrograde. So this is the Mercury Retrograde in Aries episode. I want to talk a little bit about this specific Mercury Retrograde and how to work with it. Also, hopefully dispel a couple of maybe common Mercury retrograde fears or worries so that you can have a better understanding of this cycle. So let's get into a couple of the basics to begin. First up, Mercury retrograde is not something to be feared. I actually bought my first home during a Mercury retrograde cycle. And, there are so many papers and documents to sign through a process like that. But the deal still got done. We ended up living in that house for about 5 years. And when it did come time to sell, we were able to sell for a small profit. So by all sort of measures, that was still a really successful, deal or process to go through. I share that story straight out of the gate today because when talking about Mercury retrograde, the biggest thing I see with students and clients is this worry about doing anything in a Mercury retrograde period. And I want you to know that you can still go about your life relatively normally. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, but they shouldn't stop you doing what you need to do. They might just ask you to go about it a little bit more slowly, a little bit more time for review. So remember that Mercury is the planet of communication, deals, negotiation, business, and technology. So all kinds of Mercury things might be operating a little bit differently while we're in a Mercury retrograde, but that different doesn't mean bad or always problematic. So definitely keep that in mind. A quick message about my next online astrology course. It is all about the role of moon phases on your personality and about fixed stars in the birth chart. So if you're an intermediate student wanting to improve your chart interpretation skills, I hope to see you in class. We start April 15. For more details and to register, pop over to kellysastrology.com. Okay, so back to Mercury retrograde. Let's go through the core dates and details about this particular Mercury retrograde, just so we're all on the same page about the data. Mercury retrograde starts April 1st and will continue until April 25th, a little over 3.5 weeks. Mercury is going to be retrograde entirely in the zodiac sign of Aries. So Mercury's retrograde starts at 27 Aries, and then retrograde is like a reversing cycle for a planet. And so Mercury is going to move backwards from 27 Aries to 15 Aries. So that whole second half of Aries basically is the pathway that Mercury is reversing through. Mercury does go retrograde 3 or 4 times a year. Every few months, Mercury is retrograde. So this is a really common cycle. It's happening, multiple times a year. And you've lived through many of them, and you've probably gone about your life doing all kinds of things during a Mercury retrograde cycle without even knowing about it. It's one of those cycles that, as astrology has become more and more popular, has sort of, captured the imagination of the collective such that it's something that I'm always getting asked questions about. So it's something to be aware of, but it's not something to be afraid of or to feel like you can't do anything in. Now, what I want to say about Mercury retrograde is that the energy of reviewing and redoing, maybe about communication or technology or schedules, plans, and logistics, or maybe about travel, these are all common Mercury retrograde themes. It's not as the level of caution that you might want to bring to Mercury retrograde, in my mind, should be different at different points in the Mercury retrograde cycle or the Mercury retrograde process. In short, the very start and the very end of a Mercury retrograde are probably the most problematic times for Mercury. When we're kind of in the middle of the retrograde and Mercury might be going backwards, but at a reasonable pace or speed, that's not usually as challenging or difficult as the very start and the very end of the retrograde. So the very start and the very end of the retrograde have what we call the Mercury stations in them. So when we say Mercury stations retrograde, Mercury stops, turns around, and starts to move backwards. When we say Mercury stations direct, we say Mercury is stopping, turning around, and starting to move forward again. In that sort of conceptual framework, it's the stopping part that is the most problematic. So keep in mind the retrograde phenomenon is a visual thing from our perspective here on Earth. And that's kind of the foundation of omen and divination from the sky, which includes astrology, but covers like eclipse omenology and things like that. And so we're based on what is technically the apparent backward motion of a planet. And that station or stopping point at the start and the end of the retrograde, that's where we can really hit some of those classic Mercury retrograde snafus, delays, crossed wires, even the miscommunications. So at the very start of the retrograde, if the retrograde is starting on April 1st, let's allow 2 days before and after April 1st to kind of cover off the station retrograde. And if Mercury is going to end its retrograde on April 25th, we want to allow 2 days either side of that for the station direct. So if you are particularly worried about signing or not signing something, I would say those few days around April 1st and those few days around April 25th, they might be the days to hold off if you can. But for the rest of the Mercury retrograde time, kind of proceed with awareness, with a little bit of extra attention to detail, but do keep proceeding. Keep doing the deals you need to do, making the plans, booking the travel, scheduling the things. The key with Mercury retrograde and the theory about a planet that's moving backwards is that it's in some ways a little bit less effective than normal. Now, in modern life, we live in a very mercurial world. We have technology devices on our person or in our pockets almost all the time. We are doing a lot of Mercury things, communicating, we're interacting, we are doing like all the merchant marketplace, buying and selling of things. And so doing so much Mercury all the time means there's going to be periods where things go a little bit haywire. Mercury, as I said, also rules transport and travel, as well as technology. And we have had some very classic examples over the past few years of like big outages with technology or major travel delays coming up under Mercury retrograde. But of course, we get those technical outages or those travel delays at non-Mercury retrograde times as well. And that's because Mercury going retrograde is kind of a mild affliction for Mercury, but there are other afflictions for Mercury that can be much stronger and much more problematic. And that's what I wanted to try and put into context here. How much of a concern is a Mercury retrograde really? It's something to be aware of, but there are other things that happen to Mercury that are much more problematic and tend to last for shorter windows of time. Things like when Mercury is in one of its detriment signs and making a hard aspect to a planet like Neptune. For instance, at the moment, when Mercury is in Pisces conjunct Neptune, or when Mercury is in Sagittarius and square Neptune, we get sort of a 48-hour period that is very frazzled and funky for Mercury, but doesn't seem to get as talked about as much. But to my mind, that's probably more problematic than, most of a Mercury retrograde cycle. So what could you do or what should you do during a Mercury retrograde cycle? Things that I like to do are revise, rethink, reorganized, rearrange. So with Mercury retrograde, I like to think about going back to unfinished business and trying to get caught up on, things that are incomplete. So if there are loose ends outstanding, I tend to spend a lot of time going through my email, my inbox, catching up on comments on the website, things that sometimes get a bit neglected in the regular part of life. I try to think about catching up on those things. Because this Mercury retrograde is happening in the sign of Aries, Aries, like all fire signs, is very visually oriented. I think one of the best things we could do in this particular Mercury retrograde cycle is revision. So, to take some time to rethink or kind of reconceptualize the images or the pictures that might be motivating you in your life at the moment, and kind of reorganizing the pictures in your mind or changing those images in some way, tweaking them, updating them, refreshing them. That could be a good way of working with some of the symbolic elements of this particular Mercury retrograde in a fire sign. So, in terms of the redoing, reorganizing, Mercury retrograde can sometimes be a great cycle for remembering things like, oh, that's right, I meant to organize this or get back to that person about that thing. So, going through and, getting those things caught up, rethinking, do I want to keep going with it? No, I'm done. Okay. And then we release it. These are all very constructive things that you can use Mercury retrograde for. Personally, I also like to spend a bit of time just doing a sweep through the house and seeing what things I need to return. Maybe I borrowed that dish from someone, or we hosted friends and I need to return a baking pan. Or maybe there is a broken item that needs to be returned. Maybe there's a broken item or a faulty item that needs to be repaired. All of this kind of redoing thing. Sometimes you get into the repairing or the fixing, and then you realize you need to order a special part, and that's going to take time. And sure, things might take a little bit of time, but ultimately we're getting into something that has been stagnant or ineffective or inefficient or just not working for a while. So we're doing a little bit of that sort of fixing, repairing, and then returning. If you've got maybe an online order and you need to send something back, those kinds of things are really great to do with Mercury retrograde. You could think about Mercury retrograde as a chance to kind of catch up on any correspondence or organizational matters that you have, not stayed on top of for a little while. So that idea of Mercury moving more slowly around the station, instead of going forward into something new, you can use that chance to look back and catch up on that unfinished business. Two extra quick things about this particular Mercury retrograde. It is in Aries, so it's ruled by Mars. Mars will be in Pisces the whole time that Mercury will be retrograde in Aries this year. Now, Mars in Pisces is very inspired, full of imagination, not super practical and grounded. And Mars in Pisces has a very meandering, flexible quality. And so this particular Mercury in Aries might take you off on a wide variety of tangents just based on how Mars in Pisces is kind of influencing the Mercury retrograde in Aries. And so being easily distracted is definitely going to be part of this particular Mercury retrograde in Aries. There's a little bit of caution with any Mercury retrograde in Aries, regardless of where Mars is, about that sort of speaking before thinking or agreeing before understanding. The impulsive nature of Mercury in Aries means we might rush into things, and then as we're rethinking them, we realize we might need to renegotiate. Renegotiating something is a great way of using Mercury retrograde effectively. So if there's an agreement, a contract, a plan, an arrangement that you've made that you're realizing it's not going to work for you anymore or needs to be tweaked, you can actually use Mercury retrograde for that. The second thing about this Mercury retrograde in Aries, when Mercury stations direct at 15 Aries on the 25th of April, it will be very close to the North Node in Aries. And that's going to add a real intensification as well as this kind of highly enthusiastic, impatient energy. And so when Mercury stations direct, it's sort of that I want to get going with things that I've planning and have been tweaking and reviewing. And then the pushing energy of that North Node means you might do too much too soon and then hit some of those classic snafus or bloopers. So really do think about giving yourself that 48-hour window after the 25th of April to just make sure that things are as you think they are before you rush ahead. And in many ways, that's kind of the message of this particular Mercury in Aries in a Mars-ruled sign, is this idea of that enthusiasm and that willingness to take a risk or say yes or take on that new challenge We do just want to slow a little bit so that we don't go too fast or too far too soon. And we're not agreeing to things that are going to be maybe problematic or quite disruptive to follow through in the future. And that might be particularly strong around that Mercury station around April 25th. So just keep those pieces in mind. Hopefully, this is giving you a few new ways to think about Mercury retrograde. But if you've still got questions about the whole concept and cycle of Mercury retrograde, feel free to pop them in the comments below and I can address them in a future episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, please like, subscribe, or follow along wherever you are listening. That really helps other people find out about the show too. And even better, if you could leave a review, that would be especially helpful. Most of all, though, I really appreciate you tuning in each week. I wish you all the best as we jump into this next Mercury retrograde cycle. I'll be back to share more next week. Until then, take care.